talked about this before and I forgot the answer. Why is it that the notion of presence is interdicted in TNO? We talked about it a long time ago.
I think the simple and direct answer is, and I'm not sure whether this is what you want to hear, is presence implies a notion of distance. Literally, if you go back to the etymology of it, it's the being before or in front of is the idea. To be present to something or to have something present to oneself implies some sort of an interval. So it's implicitly
Dualistic.
a mediated relation. It's as opposed to an immediacy.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good. That's sufficient.
Okay.
So
I've forgotten that discussion.
The angle which presence is being interdicted is from the totally opposite direction from which it's being interdicted by, say, Derrida.
Yes, because I think when we did Derrida, both in the text and in class, I think in Derrida, while there may be some, to use this language now we introduced here, interdiction of presence, it's not it's an interdiction of presence in the form of some sort of an absence, right?
Well, in the denial that there is any immediacy at all, of any kind.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Right, okay. But what I'm saying is he doesn't get beyond the logic or the category of presence where I'm understanding that presence is the other side of, it's the obverse of absence. And this is deep. I mean, this is not an incidental, this is not really just fussing around about language.
Yeah.
Because as I made the comment in class a couple of classes ago, I think, that although we quickly, we go lightly through the Hegelian dialectic, that the appearance is the manifestation of the thing in itself in Kantian terms. As I said a couple of classes ago, but more carefully, more subtly, more dialectically, the appearance is in a Hegelian context, would be the presence, not simply of the thing in itself, but it would be the presence of the absent thing in itself. Right? So to get beyond the category of presence and absence is importantly, on one level, to get beyond the notion of a distance other than time, a distance that has a standing of its own, which it does not have in the thinking now occurring.
Yeah.
And then, but the other thing I want to say, in a more comprehensive sense, especially when I'm dealing with Altizer, who you'll notice whose characteristic phrase, at a certain point in the development of his thought, I don't know that he perpetuates it in the most recent work, but it's substantively the same thing, this notion of total presence. The total presence, you see, in him, just as the word is heard in the silence, the light shines in and as the darkness, right? That is, the total presence of the divine for Altizer is its total absence.
Yeah.
You see, in our consciousness, or it is present to us. I think we said when we were doing this part of the text, it is present as absence. But that even the absence is present to us is what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so it's that kind of distance. Well, what I wanted to get to is that the fundamental thing, if I can put it that way, that the thinking now occurring is substituting for the notion of presence is existence, right? So existence is essentially immediacy, right? And existence, which is essentially immediacy, is that which, as it were, if there were still a place for presence, which occupies what would be, if it were not contrary to fact, would be the place of presence. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other observations, comments, questions? Okay, as usual, we're going to back up into the previous assignment before we start today's, hopefully. And I think we had at least taken note of Galileo's, I don't know whether we examined it too carefully, but on page 529 and following, his proof for the fact that the circumference of an infinite circle is a straight line, and I know we discussed it in the last class. And what Galileo wants to say is that he, as it were, proves that the circumference of an infinite circle is a straight line, and then says, well, therefore, there is no such thing, right? Because, and more importantly, there is no possibility of there being an infinite circle, because the infinite circle he has proven would the circumference of an infinite circle would turn into a straight line, which he understands to be a contradiction to the notion of circle, right? And in the thinking now occurring, what we're saying there, in and around page 534, 535, where I kind of adopt and adapt his image on 530. The essential thing I'm doing there, I've just kind of turned it over just for the sake of convenience. I don't know why. It's interesting. But you could flip it around. You could turn it over in the way in which he has if you wanted. It wouldn't make any difference, really. The point being that what you get there, to get it intuitively, is that what I've inserted in that circle is the square. You remember we had a little give and take on the fact that in the logical geometry, as I call it, in that section where a point is a zero from a logical zero, and two zeros is a line, and 4 zeros is a square. In other words, the geometrical reference in that chapter is the 4 zeros are the 4 vertices of the square, the 4 corner points of the square, except that now what we're saying is that the geometric points logically understood are not vanishing points. They're not 0 dimensions in the sense of ordinary logic, but analogously. But then we said in that same listing of the logical geometry values, as it were, that 4 points is also a circle. Right? So Jim made the cute observation that we just squared the circle. Right? The point being, therefore, that the one way of understanding that, how would you make a circle? I mean, there are many ways in which you could make a circle if you had to draw a circle from scratch, so to speak, and you wanted to get as perfect a circle as you wanted. One way, of course, I think one way would be to choose your center point and then take a line or a string and go around it and you create a circle. But another way to do it would be take any number of geometrical figures, not including either a equilateral triangle or a square, and just revolve it, right? And the 4 corner points of the revolving square would in effect trace out your circle. So that's the kind of intuition you can understand that is underlying the what I call the logical geometry in that previous chapter, and I'm just applying the same kind of sense here, that the square inscribed in the circle, when the Galilean circle expands to infinity, as it expands to infinity, the circle approaches, and at infinity, according to Galileo, would become a straight line. And what I'm trying to point out here is, at the same time, as it were, in the same move to infinity, the square that's inscribed in that circle would also become this infinite straight line, right? But it would be an infinite straight line by implication here, more clearly, more directly, in such a way that it would be divided in principle. This infinite straight line would be divided in principle into the 4 corner points, right? Into, if you want, in a kind of geometric sense, the fourfold. Now, what the thinking now occurring is saying is that, now the basic premise which we've been discussing, I think, almost from the get-go, certainly since last fall, the basic notion in the thinking now occurring is that the circle, as it were, is not composed of a set of continuous points, but the radical notion of discontinuity in the thinking now occurring allows, I want to put it this way, allows what is an impossibility in Galileo, to be not only not an impossibility, but to be an actuality. In other words, not only is the square and the circle in some ultimate logical sense indistinguishable once I admit the fundamentality of the discontinuity, the absolute discontinuity of the continuum, but also what is otherwise the impossibility of there being an infinite circle in Galileo's sense goes away, as it were, and the infinite circle is the actuality, which is not at all incompatible with the notion of this infinite straight line, as it were, as long as one understands that the infinite straight line is itself composed of discontinuous points, and most fundamentally, in a logical sense, of 4 discontinuous points, right? The points that otherwise would be the corner points of the square, because, as in effect we've understood in that section which we spent some time on last time, which I don't know whether I can just flip to it, but the section where I don't know why I'm having trouble finding it here, that grid that comes out of the folding of the bowl.
508, the kind of lattice, the crystal.
Yeah, great, thanks. There's an illustration, that lattice work, and also thanks for the expression lattice, that's quite correct, but it's escaping me. The lattice work there is built up, as we were saying last time, on the fundamental measure of the absolutely folded bowl, which we...
495.
Yeah, 495. Okay. So if you take that bowl on 495 and just reduce the scale of it, then it becomes the fundamental measure of the quadrant of each of these squares. And then the mathematics of that whole discussion, which I don't want to go through in detail again, is such, nevertheless, that the central square in each of the black bordered squares of the lattice work, the central square, by the way, is 1/36 of the area of the black bordered square. That central square, in turn, is understood to be broken into 4 equal subsquares, which appear as on the corners of the black bordered square. So those little black squares in the lattice work there are the exploded 4 subsquares of the central square, right? And that's the basic structure. And it's those squares which are understood, as it were, to be... Now here you see we've got a whole different understanding of the point. Those little squares that connect... You see, if you just look at it visually, you could see that there's no reason... And I pointed out to those of you who were in class last time, that if you heard the tape, you heard it go by anyway, that the fact that there are some white central squares here is just an aesthetic judgment on my part. In other words, they could all be white, they could all be black. I'm just leaving some white in order to highlight the black center square, right? The point being, in other words, what I'm trying to get at is that little black square that connects the larger black bordered squares of the lattice work, there's no way of, speaking a kind of Derridean term, where it's, however, not problematic as it would be in Derrida, I could say there's no way to decide whether or not that little black square belongs to the square above it, whether it's the 1/4 of the central square of the square above it, or the square below it. Do you see what I'm saying? Or the square to the right or to the left. That is to say, it is at one and the same time, if I can put it that way, although I don't like the word same, you have to be a little inconsistent, okay, if you're talking fast. It is at once, be better, it is at once, all right, the 4th part of the central square of each of the 4 squares that surround it. So in that sense, we go back to another, right, so in other words, this geometric pattern is meant to convey something, not only of it has a numerical mathematical interest of its own, which we work out in the text, but also just purely in a purely geometric sense, it should convey to you something of the immediacy, right? Again, of the identity of the point. That is to say, if that of those little connecting black squares are the points at which each of the 4 squares are indistinguishably united, so to speak, right? So the multiplication is not one, and in a certain sense, therefore, as I'm talking, it goes back to the very fundamental notion what I love about teaching this class is, I mean, I keep thinking of things from new angles. You see, it's very useful for me. And in the end of Alpha in Novitas Mundi, I make that point about the displacement of space itself, right? Not just displacement in space, right? The displacement of space, right? Because if there's no distance, well, hey, there ought not to be any space. Well, if there's no distance and no space, then if I put it in Cartesian terms, what I was about to say was that lattice work is a way of trying to present intuitively a geometry which should suggest to you that there is, in Cartesian terms, no extension. So when I talk about that central little black square being indifferently at once the fourth part of all of the squares surrounding it, what I'm saying is that the visual extension on the paper is not the point. The point is precisely that the identity of those squares is in that little square, right? You see, and therefore the extension is an epiphenomenon. It's a secondary matter to the ontological infinitely flat structure, you see, of the universe. Okay.
Say that again, because that's so cool.
The whole thing?
No, the result. Extension itself is an epiphenomenon.
Yeah. An epiphenomenon that ought not to get in the way of understanding the ontological identity of the little black square as indifferently uniting the squares that otherwise, in an extended sense, surround it. Right. So, and so then I said, and so this would be a concrete. This is a geometric pattern that should suggest to you the ontological notion that lies behind the more comprehensive notion that's going on in this part of the book of the infinitely flat structure of the universe, right? In the sense that, and in fact, in a certain sense, even though the picture on that page is flat, it could be done in 3 dimensions, but analogously to flat, pushing down a 3-dimensional world, right? Analogously, in that what is it, 508? In that lattice work, what I'm saying is that an analog to an infinitely flat structure of the universe, in the sense that a 3-dimensional world is indifferently a 2-dimensional world. Analogously, what I'm saying here is that this 2-dimensional lattice work is indifferently a 1-dimensional lattice work. Do you see that each, or in other words, that the 2-dimensional extension of the multiplicity of these squares is ontologically understood here to be indifferently reducible to 1 dimension, right? Well, what is 1 dimension? 1 dimension is a line, and as Euclid would tell you, a line is infinite. Or, as Galileo would tell you with great reluctance and pain, it's an infinite circle. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, go on.
It's just that,
okay.
There is a proof in Cantor that you can reduce all of the points of an infinite dimensioned, what would later be called a Hilbert space, can be mapped uniquely onto a 1-dimensional line. So if an n-dimensional Hilbert space could represent anything in a Cartesian universe, except rocks falling from nowhere, that entire representation could be represented by a single point.
Okay.
Anything that could be represented by n dimensions can be found at a unique point. Now, I already have that.
Right.
So I'm just wondering how
Well,
that's different, because it seems to me that we're saying something. You're not saying the same thing as that.
Well, I think it would be, what is that point at which this infinite number of dimensions can be represented?
Yes.
I would say that it's not. The 2 things that occur to me. One is that it's not
representation.
It's not a representational relationship. The infinite number of dimensions, as it were, is that point.
If that's the schema, the n-dimensional Hilbert space is the schema. Now it's the existence. Now it's existence
Okay,
itself.
yeah, right, okay, yes, and in the same sense, more broadly, philosophically, we have been saying all along that what was, as it were, the schema,
Yeah.
has, in the thinking now occurring, as it were. We always have to make this as it were because there's an essential break between previous thought and this thinking. But if there were a place for the schema in the thinking now occurring, which there isn't, but if there were, contrary to fact condition, which I love that, I learned that somewhere in Latin or Greek somewhere as a kid, the contrary to fact condition, if there were a place for a schema in the thinking now occurring, that place in the thinking now occurring would be, as it were, occupied by existence.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. There was another thing that occurred to me, which I think is probably the same thing. The other aspect of that is that the point in the thinking now occurring is certainly not a zero dimension, meaning a nothing dimension, right?
No, sure.
Yeah.
But
And I think
why-
that's connected. I think that's deeply connected with the fact that the schematic thinking belongs to the past. Yeah.
There's another link here, and I don't know how to make this work, but it seems to me it's connected too. You know, there's this side of Peirce where he deals with the map on the island, where the point on the map is that well, it's the in fixed point theorem really what it becomes. That if there is a map of a space and the map is in the space that it occupies, there will be one point on the map and in the space which are identical. And it seems like what is being said here is every point is that point.
Yeah, and again, a more comprehensive way in which it's formulated elsewhere but in the same area of the text, in the logical area of the text, is the notion that this dead center, which in 3 dimensions is a dead center cube, but of course when you read the section on the dead center cube, you find out right away the important thing about the dead center cube is that it's absolutely one-sided cube, right? All right, so right there you've conceptually collapsed the cube to a square, to a point in the thing, right? But what does it say about the absolute dead center? That it is absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
All right. For now. Okay.
We're at least in the same range of intuition.
Okay. All right. I'm only hurrying along because I am trying to catch up, and I want to do some justice to James, who is a very interesting fellow. On page 536 and 37, there's a rather extensive quote from James. The basic point of which is to distinguish his understanding of philosophy as pluralistic or a pluralism from monism. Right. If we drop into the quote on page 537 in the second paragraph of the quote, monism, on the other hand, insists that when you come down to reality as such, to the reality of realities, everything is present to everything else in one vast, instantaneous, co-implicated completeness. Nothing can, in any sense, functional or substantial, be really absent from anything else. All things interpenetrate and telescope together in the great total conflux. For pluralism, all that we are required to admit as the constitution of reality is what we ourselves find empirically realized in every minimum of finite life. Briefly, it is this, that nothing real is absolutely simple, that every smallest bit of experience is a multum in parvo, many in a little, plurally related, that each relation is one aspect, character, or function, way of its being taken, or way of its taking something else, and that a bit of reality, when actively engaged in one of these relations, is not by that very fact engaged in all the other relations simultaneously. So if I pause there and to try and immediately relate James to the thinking now occurring, well, actually what the chapter does, it does ultimately do that, but it does it through an analysis of Althuser's relationship to James. And to make it short and sweet, what the analysis is driving at of the relationship between Althuser and James is that the alternatives between monism and pluralism, between the all form and the each form, in James are in effect identified in in that night in which all cats are gray, which is the death of God theology, they're identified, so to speak, I would say, in the negative. Now, having said that, and the reason why the thinking now occurring takes Althuiser's death of God theology so seriously is that it sees in Althuiser's death of God theology, well, as I often characterize it in my writing here and there, the furthest possible extension of modern consciousness, but more immediately in the context here, you could say it is the furthest possible extension of American pragmatism in the negative, and in that furthest possible extension in the negative, by reducing, as it were, the form of the openness of American consciousness to the absolute future, to that kind of pure, that absolute blank, that absolute darkness in and as which the light shines, but only in and as darkness. In doing that, Althuyser has blended, run together, so to speak, indifferently, the all form and the each form in Jamesian language. But what he hasn't done is he hasn't done that in the way in which the thinking now occurring does it. That is, it hasn't done it in a positive, affirmative, explicit, logically and conceptually explicit way, right? Which is the whole intellectual point of the thinking now occurring. So I'm just trying to put what I'm about to say in the context of what I'm doing in this chapter. And what I was about to say was that in the thinking now occurring, what you have is the positive overcoming of this alternative between the notion of monism or unity, you say, and the notion of multiplicity, which I think I've said in another context altogether by referring back to Thales. That was his original problem, the one and the many, right? And you could say that philosophy and science has been groping in one or another form for 2,500 or more years with the solution to the problem of unity and multiplicity, all right? So, but most immediately, what James has to offer is the emphasis on the, now to use the language of the thinking now occurring, he emphasizes a certain discontinuity in reality, right? He's denying precisely the notion that everything is connected with everything else, you say, which would be one formulation of the notion of continuity. So that there are gaps, you see. It's not that there's no relationship for James, but it is not a continuous relationship, and the possibility of everything being related to everything else for James remains just that, a possibility, and the actualizing of the possibility is always going to be mediated by the adjacent minimum of reality that we're experiencing. Which reminds me, as I'm saying this now, it's so nice. The Americans are so good, and it's a credit to them that they remind you of Aristotle, right? Because anyone who reminds you of Aristotle has got to be on the right track, even though it's a different world, a different universe, right? Remember way back when, in Novitas Mundi, Aristotle, when we were making that distinction between the act of knowledge, and I thought of this again also in terms of today's reading, and it'll come up again because next time we're going to do a little more Dewey than it's even in today's assignment. I thought of Dewey too in this context, but James, now I'm thinking of James in this context. You remember Aristotle makes the distinction between the rational soul, the human intellect qua form of the body, and that divine act of knowledge, which for Aristotle, in a way that's difficult for us, is a prior reality to the thinking process. So in other words, if knowledge did not precede the thinking process, there'd be no thinking process. That's what Aristotle is saying, okay? And it's counterintuitive, it's certainly for a modern person, I think. But focusing in on Aristotle's notion of the definition of the human intellect qua human, the rational intellect qua human, you remember he defines it, the human intellect or reason as that which is potentially all things. Do you see? And we make the strenuous point in chapter 1 of and subsequent chapters of Novitas Mundi. Yes. But it's for Aristotle, it's potentially all things. It's actual knowledge is one thing at a time, so to speak, all right? Or it's really one thing out of time, okay? And so what I'm getting at is that you have an echo of that in the reticence of James when it comes to the question of everything. See, yeah, there isn't everything, and yeah, the analogy I'm making, just as in Aristotle, the human intellect is potentially all things. But it's actually one thing at a time. Analogous to that in James, and I'm saying that there's a deep analogy to Aristotle on many levels in pragmatism, and they certainly Peirce was aware of this. Analogously in James, yes, there may be, as a possibility, a relationship between one thing and all other things, but it's always mediated by that mediated by some intermediary. It's always mediated, right? In other words, and the mediated is always going to be by the next adjacent minima, right? So in that sense, there is a kind of echo of that careful. Right? So the pulling back, and this is what, of course, he's doing in this passage, the deliberate, quite deliberate and impassioned pulling back from the claims of a monistic understanding, philosophical understanding, whether it be, certainly Hegel would be a prime candidate for this, that everything is ultimately, you see, absolutely a manifestation of the divine reason, and nothing really ultimately escapes that actuality for Hegel, because it's an eternal actuality for Hegel, you see. But in a pragmatic or pragmatistic world, as Peirce has to define it to distinguish himself from James, there's an evolutionary notion, clear in Peirce, implicit in James, and therefore what? That we don't have an unqualified eternal actuality here. We have an actualizing of, in the deepest sense, the dream, right, which begins with that first set of firsts at the beginning of the evolution of the universe, when it emerges from the background of nothing in particular. Okay, well, and to finish the thinking now occurring aspect of that thought. In the thinking now occurring, what we want to say is that there is an absolute discontinuity, but the absolute discontinuity, as it were, is so perfect that as I think in today's assignment or in the previous assignment, which we may catch up with, the notion of an infinite multiplicity of unities, an infinite multiplicity of actualities, you see, such that it defies totalization in the sense of the monism that James is talking about, but not in the sense that it defies the notion of unity, right? The way I could put it, the way I'm inclined to put it, is I'm trying to think about this out loud. Really, the fundamental principle of unity in the thinking now occurring, which is saying, in a way more extreme than James, to say, saying, in other words, that there is a perfect discontinuity of what otherwise we can understand to be the continuum, right? Or maybe a perfect discontinuity of the whole, to say, if I put it in more traditional terms. Well, wait a minute. But now, am I going? But I said we can't have any chaos here, right? So if we have an absolute multiplication, a perfect discontinuity of the whole, but we're not going to have any chaos, we've got to have some kind of unification, you see, of the whole. And I have no problem saying that. I have no problem that saying that unity is absolutely differentiated. But I want to say it a different way, because I don't want to just get hung up on some abstract jargon, right? So what is the substance? What is the essence of the unity that is absolutely differentiated? What is the essence of the principle of unity in the thinking now occurring? It's freedom. In other words, if I were looking around for a traditional unifying principle of what otherwise would appear to be a chaotic infinite multiplicity, the chaotic infinite discontinuity, the unifying principle is freedom. Well, happily, a principle such as freedom which is, I think, it's like the now in which we find ourselves. Now, now, right? This now, which is the actuality of this conversation, is, as we pointed out when we started with Aristotle, it's perfectly elusive, perfectly impossible to grasp, but there it is, right? It is that outside of which there is nothing, right? But I'm saying that now is freedom, you see? And this freedom is the actual unity of what otherwise would appear to be, you see, a perfectly disordered, might appear to be, I don't think it does, but might appear to be, at first glance, a perfectly disordered chaos. All right. So one of the critiques, therefore, implicit of James and of Altizer and of the pragmatists is, I think I said it some time back, again, I don't remember how many months ago, but I said just off the cuff one day that I thought that the problem with pragmatism in the context of thinking now occurring is that it was too timid. All right, and in if I put that a little more concretely, in Faith and Philosophy, in chapter 7, where I'm doing a rather precise logical comparison with those the Hegelian box and the Peircean box and the thinking now occurring box, cornerstones, if you want to put it that way. What I say there, in distinguishing pragmatism from Hegel in this logical analysis in chapter 7 of Faith and Philosophy, is that pragmatism's advance, as it were, over Hegel is the fact that it places freedom prior to necessity. Right? Freedom and necessity appear in both contexts, you see, but the priority in Hegel, necessity comes first, you see, and freedom is a kind of reaction, a reaction to necessity, you see, whereas what necessity there is in the pragmatic understanding is an accretion, as it were, resulting from the primary act of freedom, from the primary spontaneity, might be a way of putting the person to understand. But nevertheless, you see, while pragmatism prioritizes freedom, you see, it still doesn't, as it were, absolutize it or reduce altogether all necessity to freedom. It doesn't perfectly identify freedom and necessity, even though it derives, and this is an advance over Hegel, it derives necessity from freedom. Now, in today's assignment, I'm going to jump ahead here, even though I'm not turning the page, because I'm trying to get the essence of all of this stuff. In today's assignment, I speak about the organs of sense, and I'm saying that the pragmatic understanding of the organs of sense, I'm not quoting myself now, but what I'm saying in the text, in effect, is that it is limited, and the limitation is that, unlike the thinking now occurring, it's not understood that thinking, in other words, it takes, as it were, the organs of sense as a kind of reified something or other with which it deals, right? Just as it takes nature as a kind of reification of freedom. Right? That's the pragmatic basic intuition. By the way, it's not just pragmatic, it's American. This is, Emerson says, in effect, the same thing. The pragmatists and Emerson are in one accord on this particular point. Right? So I say, now I'm just going to contradict myself because I said I wasn't going to look for the page and now I'm going to do it anyway. So that's the freedom of thinking, if I can find it. Since I'm on this, well, I'm going to...
Is it 555?
555. Excellent. Wow, I love it. You guys are really on the ball today. I mean, everybody keeps giving me the page number. This is really good. Okay, on 550. Keep your finger back here on James, though. Okay, on 555, toward the bottom of the page. Well, let's say about 2/3 of the way down. I'll put some context here. 2/3 of the way down, I say the quality ruling the one world situation is situationless, nothingless abyss. If the sense of pure self-experience is the sense of the a priori other, and the organism is a system of organs, and an organ qua organ, another, a tool, a system of tools of others, and the individual a product of the system of others, of tools, that is, of the body, society, then that which precludes the final closure, right? Now here I'm speaking in the context of my analysis of American thought, pragmatism, Altizer, and so I'm kind of generalizing here that the problem is that that is the problem. There is a problem, and the reason it's a problem because what I'm encountering in American pragmatism precludes the final closure of the situation, and that which precludes the final closure of the situation is the a priori existence of sense. Now, by that I mean, you see, the a priori existence of sense. That is the notion that sense is, as it were, a given. To say, not constructed. So, and I'm trying to make it as concrete as I can. So I say, a priori existence of sense is kind of could be read abstractly. Although, by the way, the key word there is existence of sense, because how does sense exist? Well, sense exists organically. You see. So just to make it clear, the a priori sense organs, the essentially non-qualitative sense of existence. Now, I want to come back to this passage, but if you have more than a couple of free fingers, if you hold this page, 555, and the James page, and go back to 461, I had said on page 461, speaking of the thinking now occurring, a little below the middle of the page, or starting just about the middle of the page, with the sentence that begins, if the essence of the New World Order is to create a new world, then it is clear that the transcendence of the merely relative originality of the essence of American thought, right? So the relative originality of the essence of American thought has its analog in the expression that we just looked at, the a priori sense organs, all right? While and precisely because it is the transcendental, so what is the advance of the thinking now occurring over the pragmatic relationship to the sense organs? In the thinking now occurring, what is understood is that the thinking now occurring, is the transcendental founding of the organs of sense, while and precisely because it is the absolute window of the knowledge of what is transcendent. So in the context, again, I'm just kind of wheeling freely here to make sure we cover the essence even of today's assignment, right? In today's assignment, I quote McDermott. Now, we know John McDermott is a living American pragmatist, philosopher, both a scholar, and I'm not quoting him for any other reason but that I think he's an original thinker. Now, he's not an original thinker in a comprehensive sense, right? He's not a voluminous author, but he encapsulates something that I'm saying is really the only viable, current, serious alternative to Altizer in American thought. McDermott does. And McDermott, and so maybe we'll come back to him, but just to pick out the relevant point here. McDermott, I quote McDermott's passage. Now, this passage may go back to something he wrote in the late 70s. I don't remember right offhand the copyright, but then it was even more fresh. Now we moved on. It's gotten worse, okay? But he points out that, wow, there's more to this idea of organ transplants than meets the eye. Right? We get kind of jaded, right? But, I mean, if you can transplant organs, then that disrupts our whole notion of the body, our whole notion of my organic identity. What does it mean I have somebody else's heart, liver, and kidney? Like the former governor of Pennsylvania had it for some years. I don't know if he's still going, but, right? Wow. You want to talk about discontinuity?
Do they talk?
Huh? I don't know what that means.
A lot of people say the organs talk.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. I don't want to go there.
You sound.
This is marvelous to McDermott. I mean, he points out what he really is doing is trying to point out the philosophical marvel. There's something important going on here, right? That it's going to revise. So now he like Altizer is at the end of his rope, see, right? Culturally and socially and so forth. So he puts forth this hope that maybe we can come together in some sort of sense of human solidarity and reconstruct a vision, because as he quotes the Bible, people without a vision perish, right? So he doesn't want to go back and redo. Sorry, unlike Altizer, I mean, this is getting complicated. Altizer has taken a kind of an eternal ritual of the self-sacrifice of God. He's created a kind of cosmic, what I call a black mass, and the self-sacrifice of God is the ultimate working out in time and space, you see, of this very fundamental ritual notion. And in that sense, by the way, Althuiser's death of God theology is profoundly religious in the Hegelian sense. And if you go take your mind back to Gamma in Novitas Mundi, you will, if you read it carefully, you'll note that there's a running critique of religiousness in there. And what's being contrasted with religion and religiousness is faith. Okay, so in that sense, Althuyser, and I allude to it in today's assignment, I don't know whether you catch it or not, I don't beat it to death, but in effect I identify his thinking as a thinking that is not a thinking of faith. But now I can say more explicitly here, it's a religious thinking, surely. It's theological and religious thinking, there's no question about it. It's ritualistic thinking, but it's not the thinking that the thinking now occurring is, that's for sure. And one way of understanding how it is not that is that the thinking now occurring is not a religious thinking. It's a thinking that is identical with faith, right? Now go back to McDermott. Now McDermott, unlike Althuyser, in attempting, as it were, to understand in the deepest sense the ultimate, how can I put it, the ultimate enactment of the self-sacrificial ritual, you see, which is the act of creation for Althuyser, and at once the death of God. Unlike that, McDermott is a little more pedestrian. I mean, it's misleading. He's really not pedestrian, but he's a little more Jamesian, a little more down to earth, and so McDermott's version of the desperate situation to which we have come, or the solution to the desperate situation, is not the absolute solitude of Althuyser's thought. It's the notion that maybe we can get together and create a new vision, reconstruct a vision, and you'll notice he says, and some new rituals. But the point being, therefore, unlike Althuyser, he doesn't see any value in the rituals, or ritual in caps, of the past. He wants to create, however, a new ritual. So neither of these guys is beyond homo religiosus, you say, beyond the notion of, now I can get myself back to where I triggered all this, right? Beyond the notion of homo religiosus, homo sapiens, homo religious man, right? And that, by the way, is as good as homo sapiens, right? The man, the tool maker, built an altar. I mean, they go together, right? So to be religious, to be technological, to be rational. Remember I said Nietzsche is very consistent. He understands this very well. So when he wants to get rid of the idea of God in the sense of poo-poo it, say that it's a crock, as I said many years ago, what does Nietzsche do? He understands very clearly that in order to get rid of the idea of God, to get rid of any validity to the idea of God, he has to get rid of any validity to the notion of rationality. You see? Because once I have a rational animal, I not only have somebody who builds houses, but temples, and has an idea of God, as Descartes makes clear to us in Spades, reinforced by Kant, and so forth and so on. Right? All right. So what's the connection here? How did I get off on all of this? And what's the deep running connection here? Well, if I take for granted, as it were, the organs of sense, if I don't understand in an absolutely thoroughgoing way that the transcendental consciousness is the founding, not the founding of the organs of sense, right? If I put it more broadly, of the natural world in an unqualified sense. Well, if I understand that, then I'm not quite as surprised, somewhat baffled, as McDermott is going to be at heart transplants, liver transplants, and so on, and nor am I going to be at all surprised at the notion of genetic engineering. Do you see? That all of this, and we discussed this back when we were doing Novitas Mundi, you see, all of these things are at least technically anticipations, do you see? Anticipations in a technical sense, and certainly consistent with the essential understanding of the thinking now occurring, that the world is the creation. You see, I want to say it is our creation, but now watch, where our creation is, that the unity there, that ourness, that community, that right, is not some sort of abstract common nature, but it is the free interacting of the actual concrete individuals who are working, if I put it in terms that Dewey would like, in the lab. Or, well, by the way, anywhere else for that matter, right? But I'm just trying to be scientifically concrete, right? All right, so in other words, the ourness, the society here is founded, the unity is freedom, and it's the absolutely free interaction of actually concrete existing individuals, each one of which is absolutely objective, you see, where there is no comparison, but there is in fact a relationship, you see, but it's a free relationship, and it's not in principle at least a intermediated relationship in principle. Okay, so yes, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure you're going now. Maybe you should be
Right.
going, continue going. But I wonder whether this is the time to ask
Okay.
a basic question, which has to do with you describing Althusser as being what he is doing is religion, deeply theological, religious.
Right.
And then you are saying the thinking now occurring is based on faith.
Right.
I just wonder whether you could take out a minute to distinguish one from the other, and also including belief. I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean when you talk about faith.
Right.
And so,
Right.
I'm lost on that, on those kinds of distinctions that I
Right.
would like you to make,
Yeah.
if
Okay.
possible. And I'm not, as I say, I'm not sure this is the time because you're on a roll.
Yeah, but I finished that role, I think, more or less. Paused the role. Well, first of all, the first thing when I think of faith, the first thing that occurs to me is Christianity. All right, so what I mean by faith, and that relates intellectually to the fact that nothing in the thinking now occurring can be understood apart from taking with utter seriousness, I want to say, the reality of history or the history of being, right? And here where history means that something actually, something that, as it were, was not there to begin with, essentially came to be in an essentially new way. So there's an essential transformation of the world going on. And so I cannot help but, in every sense of the word, associate that with the notion of Christianity. Now, I'll avail myself of somebody who is dangerous to avail oneself of, and that's Karl Barth, whom I've mentioned to you in a number of different contexts, the neo-Orthodox 20th century theologian who is intellectually very powerful, very radical, but unfortunately, like Kierkegaard, very modern, but within the limits of his modernity, right? Let me just set him up and then I'll come back to the faith issue. So if I say, well, what Karl Barth is a radical critic of modern consciousness. And you could say he's a radical critic of Hegel, but the whole kit and caboodle, Hegel, Heidegger, you name it, he's gonna have no place for them. And in that sense, he's got a real point of contact with Kierkegaard. Well, whereas Kierkegaard, you remember, when he backed out, so to speak, as the single individual, when he backed out as the single individual of the absolute Hegelian synthesis of the absolute claim of an absolute self-consciousness, when he backed out of that and took, in a completely absurd way, took up the position of a little guy, a concrete single individual existing, making the claim that only an absolute self-consciousness would make. And that's what effectively he was doing, but he's making it as this quite particular, concrete, existing individual. That's absurd to the nth degree, which Kierkegaard not only notes, but he beats the drum on that. That's the whole point, right? All right. So in that sense, my language, in that sense, he completely severs himself from absolute self-consciousness, qua absolute self-consciousness, but he doesn't sever himself from the notion of subjectivity. So in other words, the absurdity is that he claims for the subjectivity of the existing individual the absoluteness, right, that is reserved only for the divine subjectivity, the absolute divine subjectivity. All right. Barth also, in some way, backs out of the modern Hegelian synthesis, but like Kierkegaard, he doesn't dispense with, it doesn't occur to him, it's not because it didn't occur to these guys to do it. It didn't occur to them because they're part and parcel of modern self-consciousness, even in the negative, right? Barth also backs out of it. It doesn't occur to him to back out of the notion of subjectivity. So when he speaks of God, Barth, he speaks of God as the absolutely other, And that's, hey, sounds good. You know, thinking now occurring, he's talking about absolute otherness. So no problem with that. But when you ask what is the absolute other? What is God, the absolute other? Concretely, it's an absolutely other subjectivity. Okay? All right, so what does that... All right, so now, Barth understands that Christianity has... So in other words, his reading of the Kierkegaardian reading of the incarnation is paradox. Barth says, no. Barth says, no, it's not absurd. It's not a paradox. I mean, yes, he agrees with Kierkegaard that it's... remember I said those guys, the jokesters, the completely...
Monty Python.
Yeah, Monty Python. Now something completely different, that kind of making a cartoon out of Kierkegaard, now something completely different, the philosophical fragment, see? Well, Barth also is going to do something completely different, or he understands Christianity has in effect said, now something completely different. But unlike Kierkegaard, he doesn't concede any ground to the opposition. So Kierkegaard, in saying, well, faith is absurd, is at least conceding that Hegel has a good, natural, human understanding. And by the way, Kierkegaard qua human has the same understanding. That's why it's a trial for him to have faith, right? He has conceded that the natural understanding is there, and now he will suffer the spiritual trial of believing against his own understanding as well as the Hegelian understanding, which is the same thing. Barth says, no. It's completely different, all right. But it's not absurd. It's not a paradox for one simple reason. That there is no true understanding of either God or man apart from the Christian revelation. Or to put it more concretely, and this is why Barth said that Thomas Aquinas was the Antichrist. He said it good-naturedly, but he meant it. The reason was that in the Catholic tradition, and even in the early reformers, and this is what Barth wants to clean up among his own tribe, there is a place for something called natural theology, that based on my experience and understanding of my nature and the world and so forth, I can have, if I speak in Cartesian terms, I can have an idea of God.
He doesn't think historically.
That's a very good observation. That's a very good observation. Well, that's. I mean, Althuizer would love that. Althuizer, who was much influenced by Barth, whenever Althuizer scratches his head about Barth, that's the first thing he says. He thinks that the real problem with Barth is that he doesn't have any historical understanding.
He calls him a Gnostic.
Yeah. Okay. Now, all right. All right, I just want to position Barth, all right? And that's enough of that. Now, on the point, Barth makes a very interesting point, however, which I think is at least compatible as far as it goes. If you can get rid of all the other stuff in Barth, you get rid of his absolutely other subjectivity, you see? Get rid of his historical framework, you see? He makes one interesting point, and that is that Christianity cannot Christianity as a religion is comparable to other world religions, and as a religion, it doesn't have any particularly decisive, clear claim to superiority over any of the other religions. You see, but Barth is able to. And by the way, when he says that, that's a backhand critique of the philosophy of religion in Hegel, because in Hegel there is a superiority of Christianity historically. Not that it exists, not an absolute difference, but in Christianity and only in Christianity, historically for Hegel, does the full, true God consciousness dawn, so to speak, on mankind, you say, even though the stages of its development are there in Buddhism and Hinduism and Chinese religion and so forth and so on, right? So it's not an exclusive property, you say. And by the way, Hegel is quite right that way. So Barth understands that, right? Well, yeah, there is a continuity between all religions, including Christianity as a religion, and and religion is a natural thing. You see, faith transcends the natural order is where Barth is at, okay? And therefore, if Christianity introduced faith into the world, then the faith that now I'm making up a metaphor here. I don't know what Bach metaphor might be, but the faith that is kind of encased in Christianity, right? For which Christianity is the vehicle, the particular religion in which faith in this absolute sense enters into the world, then that faith is critical in principle of all religion, including Christianity, right? So in other words, Barth is ahistorical, and yet he's got a fundamentally radical notion of the critique of religion and of Christianity as religion. You see, an absolute, what shall I say? An absolute. Okay. Here, I can kill a couple of birds with one stone. So I was about to say, I think this is pretty fair. An absolute receptivity to the divine. So much so, you see, that all of even our Christian religion, our Christian church, the Reformed Church, if it's Barth, whoever it would be, you see, all of these are human works, says Barth, right? And they are as nothing. They are as dust, you see, compared to the divine revelation. I mean, we have to ask forgiveness for our religiosity. That's where Barth is really coming from. It's a very interesting idea. So I said, wait a minute, I just gave him credit for a kind of absolute receptivity. I'm trying to preserve the originality of the thinking now occurring. What the hell's going on here, see? Well, what I didn't give him credit for, and I can't give him credit for because he doesn't want any such credit. He doesn't want to have the notion of an absolute receptivity, which is at once essentially constructive of the existing world. He doesn't want to have that. Do you see? Okay, so what do I like? What is the thinking now occurring like about Barth? You see, he's radically segregated out, you see, something of an absolute other. He's confused it, unfortunately, for good historical reasons, with some kind of divine subjectivity. However, it's completely and absolutely other than the Hegelian notion, which is just a human work writ large, you see, from Barth's point of view. So he's segregated out the notion of a kind of pure faith, which is radically transcendent to and critical of religion, but he's done so because he's tied into the subjectivity there of modernity. He's done so at the expense of the notion of the absolute independence of the creation from an omnipotent creator that we have been talking about as the fundamental understanding of thinking now occurring. Wow. So that's, does that answer your question?
Belief.
I'm not sure. Oh, belief. Well, belief depends on the context. Belief is interesting because a belief comes up in our context, I guess you could say. It comes up in Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments, where Kierkegaard distinguishes, there's a certain kind of belief, which by the way goes back to Aristotle. In other words, when Aristotle, this issue comes up along the line in the question of the principle of non-contradiction. In Aristotle, the principle of non-contradiction or contradiction, depending how you want to phrase it, same principle, thing cannot be and not be at the same time, the same respect. That, for Aristotle, is the starting point of all thinking. Right? And you could say there's no reason for it. In fact, so he says that, he considers it sophistic to demand a reason for everything. It's a necessary starting point. So, but it's really an act of faith, pistis in the Greek sense. You see, it's something. It's not known. It's laid down in that sense based on our experience, or the better way of putting it is, it's laid down as a necessary starting point, the principle of non-contradiction, for our making our experience, for having any intelligible understanding of our experience of the world. All right, so that's one. There's an old philosophical sense of faith, belief there in that sense, and Kierkegaard uses it more particularly. He speaks of belief in the philosophical fragments in a sense which is not to be confused, let's say, with the faith that we've been talking about in Kierkegaard or elsewhere. It's the kind of act for Kierkegaard that the mind makes, and here this has roots in Augustine and through Augustine in the Greeks and in Plato. Faith is the kind of move, if I can put it that way, the kind of act that the mind engages in and must engage in when it's dealing with any historical object. So in other words, the American historian, who, if you say to him, was there really such a person as George Washington? And he will say, of course. Right? But strictly speaking, he could be deceived. Go back to the Cartesian demand for absolute certitude, something that cannot be doubted. Right? So actually, the fact that I'm sitting here in this body is much more certain, practically speaking, than that George Washington existed. Do you see? But analogously, the historian goes on documents, witnesses, testimonies. So he's got the whole historical record, which takes the form of eyewitnesses and written accounts, diaries, pictures, portraits, and put it all. But what is all that stuff? That's just an extension of the body. Right? It's all the corporeal world. So Kierkegaard points out that all historical judgments ultimately are an act of faith. Now you might say, and this is very Platonic, you see, when Plato distinguished the bowl, it's all one thing. That bowl starts with the 4 levels of cognition in Plato. The lowest of which is shadows. The second is pistis, he calls it. Faith, belief in the sense in which you're asking the question. Then comes thinking, then comes noesis, active knowledge. Right? Well, when Plato talks about pistis as not being in the intelligible world, he doesn't mean it's a complete useless thing. In other words, we have beliefs, like for example, we believe that the sun is going to come up tomorrow morning. And by the way, it's a very well-founded belief. You could say it's a kind of practical certainty, do you see? And so, but we don't know that it's going to come up tomorrow morning. That would be Plato's position, right? So there's a functional belief in philosophy, and Kierkegaard avails himself of it to distinguish any historical object as ultimately, even if the belief is founded on practically incontrovertible evidence, when I assert that George Washington existed, ultimately I believe on the basis of the evidence that I have. If I have a tremendous amount of evidence, then my belief is practically certain, but it's not theoretically certain. I could be deceived by a lot of evidence. All right. Whereas knowledge is not a matter of belief for Plato. Right? And then analogously, since I'm into this, analogously for Kierkegaard, you see, when it comes to the incarnation, I got a double problem. I got a double whammy, right? Because the problem, I would have to believe that there was a guy, the historical Jesus, he doesn't speak this way, but right, I'd have to, right, I not only can't get beyond belief when I'm relating myself to the man who presumably was the Word incarnate. First of all, normally speaking, I must believe in him in the same way that I believe in George Washington. And then then you can square that in Kierkegaard, right? Then that belief is squared when I now have to believe not only, you see, that such a claim is made in the case of this man, by himself or by others, but in order to affirm the claim, then I've entered into a realm of belief which you might spell with a capital B, and which at that point in Kierkegaard's analysis would be the equivalent, logically speaking, of faith. Right? And his point is that there's no room here for knowledge, strictly speaking, and infinitely no room for knowledge in the case of the incarnate Word as such, right? But it's true. Right now,
but
the other.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
Does the mere saying of the incarnation make it an historical fact?
Well, I'm not sure when you say the saying of the incarnation.
We say that that the divinity became incarnate.
Well, I'll give you Kierkegaard's answer. Kierkegaard's answer is, although he would never phrase it this way, but you have the benefit of having read this book and he didn't. The saying of the incarnation for Kierkegaard is the occasion for faith or offense. And if I get the drift of your question...
Put aside faith and focus on history.
Well, Kierkegaard's answer would be, and I think it's Paul's answer too, that that in your language, the saying of the incarnation is something that it did not and could not occur to any human being, qua human.
Well,
so in other words, I think...
Why do we have to reach that point to establish history?
since cultures
I'm not
throughout
sure what
the
you mean.
world
I'm not
have
sure
Well,
what you-
if history
Right.
is the story
Right.
of as an essential history,
Right.
is the story of the storyteller.
The identity of the story
Right.
and the storyteller is the way it's
Right.
formulated in Novitatis Mundi.
Right, right. Now, since we, according to all this, are, I don't know what the right word is, I'll say the product of that history. Now we say it, now if we say it, if we say that we are the product of that history, doesn't that make it so? Historically.
Well, I guess so. I mean, I'm not sure when you say make it so.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to get away from belief here. I mean, if it almost doesn't make any difference how we got here. We have this body of history, of essential history, and why not work backwards instead of working historically from back to front. We're at the front. Let's work backwards now. We need to. I mean, your
In a
whole
sense, we
idea
are
is
working backwards.
Pardon me?
In a
Your
sense,
whole
we
idea
are.
is we need to look forward anyhow. We need to look forward to creation.
No.
And
No looking forward. Looking here and now.
okay. Well, looking forward and backward. But anyhow,
Insofar as the former and the latter
our
are
existence
here and
right.
now.
Fine.
And so in that sense, I think I agree with you, although I don't know where you're trying to take it.
Well, I'm trying to universalize what would otherwise be a parochial enterprise.
Oh, well, yes. Okay.
In other words, if in fact the derivation of all this is Christian,
Right.
and if in fact we are about a universal enterprise here that involves non-Christians.
Right. Because if I use a Bardian analog here,
Yes.
the faith that the thinking now occurring understands as its identity, or there's so many issues here. Its quality. Transcends its Christian origin qua religion,
Right.
right? So the universal. So if I put it in just plain old traditional terms, the universal mission of Christianity, the universal claim of Christianity, at the point in history in which it is, I would say, now being realized, right, transcends the distinctions between it, historically, qua religion, and other religions. Yeah.
But how does faith decide which pieces of the Christian religion it is concerned with? You pick and choose. You act like a good Protestant. You examine the traditional material and say, "Yep, incarnation."
Of course, at this stage in history, acting like a good Protestant is not a bad idea. Go on.
Well, whatever. But the point is that you force the Protestant forces everybody into the situation of having to make decisions
Right.
about what kind of whether it's belief or faith or claims to knowledge. You say, okay, incarnation, Eucharist, creation, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you actually reject. It's not all completely clear. I know some things, but what I'm saying is that how is that? How does that happen? Now, is faith? I can, for myself, there is a kind of intense ascesis in relationship to the propositions of the religions, and an examination of my own experience that I'm always involved in. to try to authenticate something as opposed to accept something.
Did I miss something, or I thought it was implied that faith is not involved with religion.
Well, that's the point. But if faith, nonetheless.
So, but you said,
Well,
how do you
what-
choose
No,
what kind of religion
because
to have faith
clearly
in?
faith is not completely withdrawn from religious terms, religious categories, religious concerns. So how does it know which ones are religion and which ones are appropriate to it? Particularly since it can't do it on the basis of what's its own. It's not a matter of self-examination, and yet there is some kind of examination of experience that is essential to this. So I'm just asking
It sounds like the kind of question you're asking I haven't gotten to yet.
Good,
That's what
okay,
it sounds like.
all right.
I think.
Fine. You
I
mean
think
today or forever?
No, I mean as a.
You're working.
It sounds like a project.
Yeah,
In other
yeah,
words,
okay.
it sounds like
Okay.
a separate region or area to,
Oh, good, okay,
to
well, that's-
explore in and of itself.
Good,
Yes.
maybe
Right.
that's
But
why we're talking to each other.
Yeah, but, right. And the reason I haven't gotten to it is because I consider this work and maybe my work in general to be fundamental, more fundamental, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're asking a kind
No,
of
okay, fine.
application type question.
No, that's good. You've most of the times when I've sort of come up with the kind of what look like to me the essential questions, you've several times said that, and that seems
Okay.
to me perfectly fair.
Okay. Let's
Thanks
see.
for your exhaustive answer.
Well, wait, I didn't finish.
Not quite.
A belief. The other people for whom belief is critically important are our friends, the pragmatists, James and Peirce and Dewey, where, in effect, going back to Peirce,
First.
but in all of them, differently read, right? Remember I said shorthand for Peirce. I don't know whether he ever speaks so succinctly himself or not, but he might actually say this himself somewhere. But anyway, it's the essence of what he's saying about, which makes pragmatism essence, is that a concept is a rule for action. I think I've said that before. And James is impatient of that notion of because the rule for action is kind of postponing the action, right? In other words, Peirce's reading of that, or what Peirce says, James reads that as well. He's making an idea or a concept a possible action, right? He's relating right to a possible action, but James wants to get right to it, right? Get rid of the notion of possibility, right? So he wants an immediate relationship, as it were. This is good, between the idea and action. And in today's assignment, I think in one of the footnotes, I think it's in today's assignment where I quote Peirce saying in a very essential way where he and James part company, and that's the footnote in which he says he understands he understands.
It is in today's.
It is in today's, right? All right, let's see if I can find it because it's worth. Actually, it's very relevant.
It's on 552.
Okay. I think it's a distinct disadvantage of having read this text, having written the text, to be able to find pieces of it. On page 552, on footnote 8, I quote Peirce saying, "The pragmatism of James, whose definition differs from mine only." This is only, but this is a major headache for him. He's being very polite here, right? Differs from mine only in that he does not restrict the meaning, that is the ultimate logical interpretant, as I do, to a habit, but allows, but by a habit he means a concept, right? The habit is an intellectual habit. This is a notion of a thought that goes back to at least to Thomas Aquinas, right? It's very right. So in other words, we're very familiar. I think, just naturally speaking, we're familiar with the notion of ordinary habits. You know, a habit of smoking, or if I put it in moral terms, in Aristotle's Ethics, right? What is virtue in Aristotle's Ethics? Well, virtue is actually the habit that the soul acquires by doing virtuous acts. So you become a just person as a result of doing just acts, and if you do enough just acts, you will get in the habit of doing just acts, so that the next time you're confronted with a choice involving justice, if you have the virtue of justice, your inclination, you will be disposed to do the right thing. You see? Okay, so in other words, one just act doesn't make a just man. Right? And by the way, therefore, neither does one vicious act make a vicious man. A vicious man is one whose habit is vicious, who's in the habit. Right? Okay. Now, the reason I conjure that up is to say, analogously, in the tradition, certainly for somebody like Thomas Aquinas, I'm not sure, I guess this would apply to Aristotle, but I don't recall it being, I guess you could say, yeah, it's there, but it's much more explicit in Thomas, that concepts, ideas, are that is, complex feelings endowed with compulsiveness to be such. In other words, what he's saying is that James understands intelligibility, meaning, I don't like the word, so I'm resisting it, but it's his word, and they all mean what they say, right? Because meaning is a word that is involved with intentionality, right? With consciousness as intentionality, with a consciousness which is a relationship to an object as other than it, and which I'm saying implicitly, therefore, at the other end of that intention, at the other end from the object of an intentional consciousness, is an ego that is distinguished from the consciousness. Right? So, if in the thinking now occurring, the transcendental ego is the transcendental consciousness, that's another way of saying, by implication, that the consciousness of the thinking now occurring is not intentional. That the knowing, which is the constructing of the thoroughgoing construction of reality, is not a question of meaning. Okay, so that's important, but it's a little more than we need here. But I just want to say why I'm resisting his language. So anyway, so I'm going to use a neutral term then. The intelligibility, the intelligibility of something for Peirce is a matter of habit, of intellectual habit. That is, the idea as, or the concept as, the rule for action, right? So in other words, you see the connection why he's using the word habit there in my moral analogy. In other words, if a concept for Peirce is a rule for action, what does that mean? I have a certain idea which my mind is habituated to. You see? And if I really have such an idea, a habit of mind, a way of understanding things, then of course, in that future possible case when it emerges, I will act in accordance with that. You see? And that's...
It's like backing up from the Kantian categorical imperative, where the categorical imperative is as it were, extracted from behavior and proposed as the maxim that guides the behavior. It's like Peirce is putting it back in and saying, no, it's not like a rule in the sense that you've got this rule and now you obey it through some discontinuity. It's the actual way in which your behavior exhibits the regularity of a concept. Right? I mean,
okay. Well, let me say it the way I think, and this may fit with what you said. I'm not sure. Go back to what I was saying about Aristotle. I think that's fairly clear on a moral level, right? Okay. The deep thing in Peirce, when he disagrees with Descartes, which he does, by the way, in a couple of places, a couple of key places.
About doubt and belief.
Yeah, I don't know whether I quoted it in here. I can't remember, but in any event, I think I do definitely quote it in Faith and Philosophy. Peirce will have no truck with the Cartesian meditations because, in his language, Descartes' notion of consciousness is introspective. And Peirce wants to deny that there's any such... You see, this is already on the way to what I call absolute exteriority. Okay? The first thing Peirce wants to do epistemologically, psychologically, anyway, is to deny that there is any such thing as an introspective consciousness. And what does that mean to him? It means that the mind is and now I'm going to say, you see, it reminds me of what I just finished saying about the creation of a moral habit in Aristotle. The intellectual habit, the concept, comes from inferences. The mind as a whole and its subsets, the habits that compose it, are inferences from the external world. See? So there's an infinitesimally imperceptible process of judgment, not necessarily an explicit judgment, see? But our whole experience of the world for Peirce is judgmental in the syllogistic sense. It's an inference. By the way, it's more particularly, I think fundamentally it's a hypothetical inference.
Well, it's an inference that he's already analyzed, so that the actual inference itself is reducible to affirmations and conjunctions, negations and conjunctions. He actually performs that with a kind of almost Venn diagram, these existential diagrams.
Yeah.
So that means not the inference, which things, one proposition inferred another, is reduced back to something much nearer, which is yes and no.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm
sorry. Well,
okay.
there is an analysis of inference,
Right.
that makes it something a little bit more concrete than it ordinarily is if you're talking about inference. Okay, it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there are levels of analysis,
Yeah.
but before we get to analysis, what he's saying is that the mind that I have, the consciousness that I have, is in its construction before I get around to any kind of deliberate. So I think that's really the whole point. Before I get around to any deliberate, as it were, introspective analysis, I need to understand that there is no introspection. That the mind is an inference from an external reality. So it's the priority. This is a more technical issue for Peirce, related to the broader point that I make about the originality of pragmatism over against. And this is what James is talking about. This triggered this whole discussion: monism versus pluralism. All right. There is no the priority of the external to the internal in Peirce. That's what it comes down to. That if I were to think of the mind as internal, then that so-called internal mind is dependent upon an inference from reality. And the priority of the outside over the inside, not to the exclusion altogether of any inner, but to the priority of reality. See, the contact with reality, the reality is prior to the thought of it, not separable from it. I mean, they're not separable from one another. There's no place I can drive a wedge between them, right? Because there's an infinitesimal approach of consciousness or thought to a primary reality. But that's the whole point. There is a primary reality from which, if I back off, so to speak, to higher and higher levels of cognition, you see, I must understand that the higher levels of cognition, the higher levels of consciousness are nothing more than a higher level of clarification and specification of what is originally a very dim, a very incomplete, a very tentative, if you want, inference that results from or is the form of the contact with some primary reality. I can never know that reality except through the medium of this inferential process, which at its highest levels is my consciousness. You see? But the point I'm trying to emphasize is that at the root, at the starting place, so to speak, even though just as I can never get to the full actualization in the future cosmologically in Peirce, I mean, it's there, and that's the goal, and that's what everything is tending toward, but we never actually arrive at it. We'll go backwards. In thought, right, this course is a good example. I clarify certain things, right, that are less clear in my mind before I rethink them and think them again or think them through and so forth and so on. And this book started with a meditation of some sort, conscious or unconscious, on Novitas Mundi, and that started with some sort of dim apprehension, you see, of something going on here, right? And the 12 chapters of Novitas Mundi, Altizer read it and said to the publisher, well, this is very important, but he doesn't quite ever say exactly what it is. Remember I told you about that letter he wrote to the publisher, and then I wrote the prologue. Okay, well there's a very concrete example of what Peirce is talking about, but this is in principle for Peirce, not just a biographical thing, right? In other words, all consciousness begins with a very dim, relatively unclear, but nevertheless real thought, or thought of the real. You see?
Is that true of the divine consciousness as well?
I'm glad you said that, because somewhere, maybe in this book, maybe we'll hit this. Yeah, I think in the last chapter, I make the distinction between Peirce and Jonathan Edwards on this point. And Jonathan Edwards speaks of the divine mind as a consciousness. Peirce is careful to avoid that. And the difference is that Jonathan Edwards says that the divine consciousness, which in him is automatic, understanding of the divine mind, there's no possibility of conceiving of absolutely nothing. That to Edwards would be absurd. Whereas Peirce has the, whatever there is, temerity to say, well, I think I said this to you in a very different context. He says, this is the great thing about his thinking, about this postponement idea. Well, it's true. I don't know whether he had Edwards in mind or not. He says, but nevertheless, he says somewhere, it's true that we cannot conceive of absolutely nothing. We can't conceive of nothing in that sense. But we can conceive of a mind that can conceive of it, even though we can't. And that's the divine mind.
Question about the use of the word external reality.
Yeah.
That includes the sensations of the body, I would assume. You don't mean external to the body.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding you right, yes, it would. In other words,
That's what I
the
thought.
awareness of the body would be an awareness, a consciousness of the body would be a consciousness that derives from the body as external,
Yeah.
as well as whatever might be further external to the body. All consciousness derives from this. Now, I didn't finish my broad thought. The most fundamental thing I've said all along about pragmatism, distinguishing it from the absolute self-consciousnness of Hegel, the fuzzy Hegelianism of American consciousness is that it has, and you see this in the way in which firstness, secondness, and thirdness in Peirce cannot be superimposed on one another. They are structurally different categories of phenomenological consciousness, right? Whereas in Hegel, Peirce's critique of Hegel is that I can collapse them. They're all just different levels. They're the same thing. That's what he's saying. The trinity, as it were, the triune in the threeness in Hegel is really one thing, in different phases, in different moments, which of course Hegel in his own way is saying that. I mean, Peirce is not distorting Hegel in that respect. But Peirce is saying in his phenomenology that firstness, second, and thirdness, which would correspond roughly to the indeterminate universal, the level of determination in Hegel, and the concrete moment of individuality. Right? In Peirce, firstness, second, and thirdness corresponding to universal, particular, and individual, they are not simply three moments that are identical at different stages, identical something or other at different stages. They're irreducible to one another. In other words, unity is indivisible, right? It's that absolutely indivisible quality. It makes no reference to anything else, and it cannot reference itself. There's no self-reference, right? And secondness is what? Secondness is divided into two forms of secondness. You know, if you could diagram this somewhere, I think I do this. I don't know, not in this book, maybe in Faith and Philosophy, or at least I allude to it. And thirdness for Peirce, there are three forms of thirdness. Well, if there are three forms of thirdness and two forms of secondness and one form only of firstness, obviously I can't superimpose them. You see, they're incompatible. You can't. They're there. They're related. You can't take them apart. Actually, their relationship to one another, they all play into one another, but they're not collapsible into a simple unity. So what does that mean? Secondness, which is the category of otherness, usually cannot be sublated in the Hegelian sense. The other, right? The analog of the fact that the other is not finally reducible to the self, although it's always related to the self and the self to the other. The analog of that is the epistemological fact that thought is always related to an other than itself, which is the primary reality. Do you see? And it's in response to and it is the way of apprehending that primary reality. And what's, I think, also quite original about Peirce, seems to me, is that the form of apprehension, unlike for all of the Aristotelianism, for all of the classical reminiscence in pragmatism, the modernity is that where you would expect some sort of simple perception, see, this is what goes back to Peirce and James, a simple perception of the reality, which is getting more and more clear. The perception is a inference. See, the perception is really a conception, right? And an explicitly logical, even if rudimentary, you see, very primitive inference. That's what he's saying, right? It's a judgment, if I put it in the simplest terms, even though it's a rudimentary and very indefinite, relatively unclear judgment. It's an act of judgment. You see, so what's missing in Peirce, and we ought not to be surprised at this, is that notion in Plato and in Aristotle in different contexts, that the act of knowledge is a simple, pure intuition or perception. Just see, when I see the tree, I don't make any. I'm speaking. Peirce is denying this. You understand? I don't want to confuse you, but I'm saying traditionally, and in an everyday sense, when I see the tree, I don't experience myself. I don't think of myself as making any inferences. I see it. So the ancient mind said that the act of knowledge is an intellectual form of perception which transcends judgment, which transcends the thinking, the anoia, the thinking process, right? And so what I'm calling to your attention is that despite the analogies that are there to Aristotle in pragmatism, at this key point, you see, we don't transcend, even in pragmatism, we don't transcend the judgment. We don't transcend reason to some sort of divine act of knowledge in the Aristotelian sense. Or we don't transcend judgment to, or we don't confuse, and that's what Peirce is saying. We ought not to. He doesn't, for sure. And he's very suspicious of James's procedure here. We don't confuse the act of intellection with percept. It's a concept, and where concept means, as it would in Hegel, the living concept is a syllogism, the living notion, right? So we don't confuse thought with percept, because percept as distinguished from concept, okay? Insofar as the percept is not a habit acquired by an inferential understanding of an external reality, to the extent to which that's the case, then the percept is not the proper locus for intelligibility or meaning. That's what Peirce is saying over against James. Now, again, just to jump ahead, because I want to get it out. Right? I don't do this especially altogether in today's reading, but I think it's there at a certain place. When you think of Peirce as the concept guy and James is the percept guy, which he's complaining about, then Dewey is going to be in American thought and by the way, I think I pointed out to you, Dewey as a young man was a Hegelian, so he's set up for this. He embodies the notion of synthesis. In Dewey, we're going to have a synthesis of the pragmatic notion of the concept as a rule for action, or as the locus of intelligibility, and the Jamesian demand that we get rid of the possibility aspect of things and have a direct and immediate relationship, you see, between intelligibility and action. Right? The synthesis is going to come out in the form of Dewey's insistence, Dewey's form of pragmatism, which is lurking in my analysis of McDermott, called instrumentalism. Dewey's synthesis is, well, he agrees with James that this ought to be a here and now kind of thing. Intelligibility ought to be a here and now kind of thing. But he also agrees with Peirce that it can't be reduced to merely perceptual level apart from the notion of concept. So what is the concrete form of the synthesis of percept and concept in Dewey? It's the scientific method. It's the experiment. Because in the experiment, the actual experiment, and by the way, it can be in the lab, but it could be the political experiment that's going on in Congress and Washington every day of the year and every decade of the century and so forth. In other words, the synthesis is the actual experiment in which, on the level of immediacy, James's level, you see, ideas are tested by being put to the test, by being put into action. And while I'm on Dewey, again, another anticipation of the absolutely unqualified understanding of the thinking now occurring is that for Dewey, the point of science, right? So science is not what's in the textbook. Science is not a body of dead knowledge on a piece of paper, right? Or it's not the latest results. That's not science. Science is an activity. It's an act of knowing, see? And the act of knowing for Dewey then is not going to be is going to be this synthesis of concept and percept, and its purpose is to create. And I think this will say in a later reading we're going to do in a session or two. It's going to be the creation, the production of new individuals. Right? On the way to doing that, the way you produce new individuals, says Dewey, is that knowing is really a disturbing of reality. It's introducing into the otherwise, and here we come back to the larger point I was making in James and in general in pragmatism. It's introducing change into the environment, right? So when you do something that changes the environment, you're doing science in its essence from Dewey's point of view. Of course, add on to that, you really ought to be doing it in a deliberate, formal way, right? But the essence of what you formalized in science is the experiment, and the experiment is the conjunction of apparatus, percept, you see, and hypothesis, concept, and they work together. They're inseparable. And the function is to change the environment. That's what the apparatus is for, and then to produce a result, and that result is going to be something new, right? But again, the pragmatist is assuming there, even Dewey, as concrete as he is and as into change as he is, he's assuming there what I call in the text the a priori nature. You see, a nature, as it were, as a given to be disturbed, to be worked on, right? Okay, so that closes a large circle as far as that goes. Now, did I get? Yeah. Oh, okay. So belief. There's an important role for belief in American thought, because thought is a belief in every sense of the word. In Dewey's sense, it's called the hypothesis. And by the way, Peirce would have no trouble with that either. He's also into hypothetical thinking, right? So, in other words, a thought is something. See, in other words, it's a rule for action, or it's something that makes a difference in an actual action for James, or it is the hypothesis governing a scientific experiment. Do you say? In any event, in all cases, it's belief in the sense that it's proven out in action. Do you see?
Okay, it's also that I mean, there's a particular piece of Peirce that I remember.
Okay.
In which he explicitly attacks Cartesian meditations.
Yes.
For the kind of abstract nature of the doubt. He says that
That's right.
We don't doubt. Doubt is an irritation. Doubt is a problem.
Right.
It's the first stage in a process, which
Right.
ends
Right.
in the end of doubt,
Yeah.
and that's belief.
That's right.
Belief is
Yes.
what happens.
Okay.
When
Well,
you,
belief would be the habit
that
you're the habit of mind in every sense of the word, and that helps me reinforce the point I want to make. All right. So notice, and I do make this point in Faith and Philosophy when I'm contrasting Nietzsche and the Americans, because in American thought, and you've just given the proof text, in American thought there is what certainly would strike Nietzsche, and he would dismiss it immediately as hogwash, a complacency of thinking. In other words, the normal state of mind in American thought is
habit.
belief or a habit of thinking. And why would you A habit is something you're used to. You're comfortable with. And we're very slow to change our habits, right? Why would you change your idea of anything unless you confronted a reality, or a reality confronted you that forced you to rearrange your mental furniture, you see, in order to account for it? Well, once you finish doing that, you're happy. Okay? So the distinction he makes from Descartes is that, in fact, there's this theoretical doubt is complete abstraction. Yes, it's not that we don't doubt, but we only doubt when we're forced to.
Yeah.
And so the only doubt that's worth speaking of intellectually, but it's taken very seriously intellectually by Peirce, is the practical doubt that we have to have about what we thought was the case when we're confronted with something that doesn't square with it, doesn't fit with it. You see? And once we can square the novelty, see? Yeah, here's the point I'm trying. My overall point in terms of the thinking now occurring, you see, is that this is a strange way of saying it, but it kind of perversely fits with Nietzsche. It's the inside out of Nietzsche. I was going to say, so the American thinker is in principle, I don't know whether perpetually, but maybe I'll say perpetually for the thinking now occurring, but I was going to say the American thinker is set up to be surprised. Well, now, but if there is no complacency to thought, if thought is not a matter of habit, you see, if thought is a matter sheerly of creation, then I could say you're perpetually surprised, or you're never surprised. At that point, it would come to the same thing. It's not a matter of surprise, right? And there's something deep which I can't just conjure up now, but it's in my faith and philosophy text. There's a point of contact there with Nietzsche, right? But I can't make it. I can't make the synapse. I can't make the jump. But anyway, it's clear then that so that complacency and surprise. The surprise is at what? At something that doesn't fit, and that's you could say it's a very pragmatic definition of what's new. And you know what happens when you say something that's new, right? People's first instinct, the natural human instinct, is, well, I've heard that before. That sounds like Hegel, is it? Because what do we want to do? We don't want to be discomfited by something so really new that we can't really digest it. Do you see? But if what's really new is that we don't have a stomach that doesn't have to see the new as implicitly in conformity or disconformity with the past. Do you see? Where the new is so new that comparative issue, the need to fit it into some pre-existing. So when I say the novelty is all the way down, this infinite, the essential novelty of existence. The essential novelty of existence is, as it were, all the way down. That is, that the surprise doesn't go away. The surprise doesn't go away. There is no surprise because there is no blank. We keep saying the contrary to fact condition. If there were a blank into which the schema would go, it would be existence. Yeah. But it's a contrary to fact condition. There is no blank.
There are no assumptions.
Preconceptions. That's right.
I said assumption, but
yeah. Well, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just using another word which I think I use in the text.
Could I get your sense of September 11th as an event, a reality that we hadn't generally anticipated, and that has, in the political laboratory, produced a radically different response? Is that a thought or whatever it is? Does that fit in with what Dewey would think of as particularly American pragmatism?
Well, yeah,
we're going to attack other countries before they attack us.
Oh, well, now you've extrapolated. You've gone too far. If you just stay with the event, the surprising event, which I thought was where you were at.
Fine.
The surprising event.
Stay there.
I know four people in this room who weren't surprised.
Okay. But to the extent to which, well, he said, he did qualify. He said generally it was surprising. To the extent to which it was surprising
Because
because
those people weren't in the government.
They were. They may have been.
In this room?
Yeah.
I think this is a very dangerous time. It's going to get us all the way. This is where we don't want to go. So I don't know where we want to
So
go.
is Chuck responsible for 9/11?
Yeah, my fault.
Pretty sure, yeah.
To the extent to which it was surprising because it contradicted a certain mindset, political and cultural mindset, a kind of invulnerability, right? Couldn't happen, wouldn't happen, whatever, okay? But yes, without beating it to death, yes, there's a response to it. And broadly speaking, without getting into the politics of it, what did it bring about? It bring about a reordering of the American mindset. I mean, it's still, I don't say it's finished, right? There's a debate going on about because the Patriot Act represents a reordering of priorities, so that for 50 or more years at least, there was a wall of separation between the intelligence and the law enforcement functions in the government, and now that wall has been breached in response to
Well, apparently
this
it hasn't.
surprise. Huh?
Apparently it hasn't.
Well, I know. That's what I'm saying. So that's another. We need that's a class in political science. It's another one of these regions we haven't gotten to yet. But the broad principle is operating there. See, and we do react to surprise, and it makes us think differently than we did before. That's the basic attitude, and that's very down to earth. You know, I mean, it's very practical, pragmatic, and that's what pragmatism is all about. And in that sense, pragmatism is very close to the. It's very close to the notion of an incarnate transcendental ego, you see? But it's holding back, is what I'm trying to say in different ways here. Okay. All right. I wanted to try and do some, I think it's probably impossible. All right, I think I've said the basic truth of James and Altizer. It's not doing justice to them, but if you have specific questions, please use the forum. Let's move into today's assignment. The first thing I notice, it's interesting. I don't know that I didn't quite intend this, but it's the way it fell out. At the beginning of the previous chapter, I think I quoted James on the substance of divinity in the Eucharist, and now I have Dewey, who is Dewey is the least obviously religious in the normal sense of the word. Now I don't want to. It's interesting. Of the three American thinkers. In other words, Peirce uses a certain generalized religious notion or a generalized notion of Christianity as the civilization of love, and that for him is a paradigm, as I think in some sense it is implicitly, if not explicitly, in Emerson, of the, I think, and I can say this in Peirce's context without distorting anything, of the possibility, you see, of the world, of the organization of human society. James has a whole study. Many parts of his thinking are explicitly devoted to an analysis of the significance and the meaning of religious issues, religious consciousness, and so forth and so on. Dewey is the most secular, obviously secular of the three of them. Although, by the way, it's important to note that Dewey, in a very nice, great little book you have to read sometime if you haven't already read it, called The Common Faith, and that's an interesting book to read if you want to explore how a pragmatist like Dewey, in effect, reduces faith to belief in the pragmatic sense of the word, you see? And therefore is not talking about anything like what Kierkegaard would have. But nevertheless, Dewey is very critical of the idea of God. Very good. But and he thinks it's a bit of an encumbrance because, you know, when you say God, people have all sorts of deep understandings and prejudices and thoughts that they got from their childhood and their particular religion and so forth and so on. And, you know, Dewey's really embarrassed by all this stuff because he thinks it's very misleading. For him, God is the ideal unity, you see, of concept and action, right? That's what God is. He is the ultimate. It's a kind of pragmatic version of something that's going on in Kant. See? But Dewey is less sanguine about it than Kant is, because he's more pragmatic. Right? So he considers in the common faith, just in passing, the book is not about this particular issue, but going where he's going, he considers the possibility maybe he could dispense with the idea of God. No, he doesn't want to do that, because that would be misunderstood too, and he look like some sort of militant atheist. See? So, in other words, the pragmatists are enough. In other words, they do incarnate, maybe not the transcendental ego in the sense of the thinking now occurring, but pragmatism is some kind of incarnation of the idea of God. Do you see? And so, another way of putting it is, Dewey will not get rid of the idea. See, he's not Nietzsche. The complacency of thinking operates on a number of levels, and although he's not particularly keen on the idea of God and the term God, rather than eliminate it and appear to be an atheist, you see, in the sense in which in his day would have been, Lenin and Stalin running around with militant atheism, right?
Very un-American.
Well, un-American, but deep. We had this thing. The Cold War has a deep ontological underpinning, right? And so what I'm getting at is that God survives as a term, even in Dewey, because it has a real ontological meaning. Because, in other words, pragmatism, for all of its pragmatics, for all of its commitment to worldly action, right, and change of the world and so forth and so on, nevertheless remains irreducibly idealistic. It postpones the ideal to the indefinite future, the realization of the ideal, but it's there as right. So it has an idea. It has an ideal of the absolute idea. It's something like that. Okay. Anyway, just again positioning Dewey. But what I wanted to say, call attention to here is a nice coincidence, which is not really a coincidence, because I'm selecting these texts de facto because I'm trying to illustrate implicitly, if not explicitly, where the thinking now occurring has its antecedents, at least in a formal way, right? So already, I think I've done enough. I've done a lot of that, even today. And so this is just one more good example of that. Dewey, who is not a religious man in any obvious sense, or except only in that fine sense in which Hegel is a religious man, right? That is in the sense that he doesn't have faith, but he believes in the idea of God as indispensable, even if awkward. Dewey is committed in principle, as he tells us there, from his early youth, right? From his days in school, college or graduate course, whatever. It sounds like a college course to me. Where it dawned on him that the best way of understanding the organization of reality was in terms of the body, of an organism, right? So if the fundamental notion, and so you put that together with James, so I mean, these guys, they've got the pieces here, but they can't get it together, right? Because the body, in James's quote, only exists if, on independent grounds, you believe in the substance of divinity in the Eucharist, right? So he's got a notion of the body as substance. And boy, that would have pragmatic significance for James, right? If you believe that, but you'd have to do it on independent grounds. And in the meantime, what the cash value for James is not the substance, you see, but it's the appearances, the sensible world of our experience, the perceptual world. Okay, to close that little circle, right? So if you could take Dewey's regard for the body, as it were, right? And combine it with the as the paradigm, as the structure of a true understanding of reality, and combine that with James's notion of the substance of divinity, which has only a parochial meaning to James, right? If you combine those, you get something in the direction of the thinking now occurring, where what's being said is that yes, Dewey is right. The world is organic. It is an organism, but that body is the substance of divinity. That's right. That's the combination in the thinking now occurring. Okay. Now I relate that ideal of Dewey to again to Altizer, who's running through this chapter as well as I guess places in the previous. and I say over on page 548, toward the bottom of the top paragraph, about 5 or 6 lines up. Well, maybe I should. Yeah, we'll start after the parenthesis, about 8 lines up. So regards the perception of the pluralistic reality of the world, and which finally, while it does not uncritically regard self, can be said, since science and pluralism are respectively and relatively its simple and complex faces, to so regard being on the way to self. Or on the other hand, there is the experience. All right. So in other words, let me pause there. What I'm in the context, what I'm saying is that pragmatism, most specifically, most concretely, in the form of Dewey's so-called instrumentalism, all right, is a critical examination of the path to self-realization. I think that's a pretty good summary statement. I think it's very true concretely in Dewey, but I think it's another way of saying what I've been saying more generally about pragmatism. All right, in other words, when I say that it refuses in principle to reduce the other to the self, that's another peg on which you could hang this notion that it is not an uncritical, but rather it is a critical understanding of the path of being on the way to self. Do you see? So I'm saying that in the context of American pragmatism, you have that, the upfront, positive, affirmative notion, pragmatic notion. Or, on the other hand, there is, and so now we're turning back to Altizer as the upending of pragmatism, the reduction to nothing of that postponed absolute self or what better way of putting it, I have to be careful, that postponed absolute self-realization in pragmatism, the upending of that postponed absolute self-realization, infinitely postponed in pragmatism as such, the upending of that, the reduction of that to nothing in Altizer. So I have either pragmatism in the ordinary sense of the word, or on the other hand, there is the experience of the solitude absolutely underlying the superhuman Nietzschean yearning of this methodology. The pure experience of another self, completely not self, the actual experience of the actual death of God. The reality of the death of God is the actual sensation in the interiority of the organism of the final solitude of God. That is, the recognition in the interior depths of individual consciousness of the fact that society is the only body. But what I don't say in that particular sentence, but in the context, but this only body, right? Society is the only body, but this body is, in the theology of the death of God, it is the body of the dead God, right? In other words, it is the body in which has been fused the Jamesian alternatives, right? So where the each form and the all form have been fused together, right, blended together in the darkness of in the darkness that is the form of the light in Altizer, in such a way that what would be each one in James, right, is the locus, if I can put it that way, of the common experience of the absolute evacuation of all that we have hitherto known as individual self-consciousness or self-identity. So the death of God experienced concretely in the world is this common shared sense, you see, of that there is a new world, or in his language, Altizer's language, a new humanity that, as he says, can neither be defined nor conceived, right? So the absolute or the infinite postponement of an absolute self-consciousness takes the form in Altizer of an absolute future, of an absolute, in purely logical terms, of an absolute possibility, which is in some sense, the absolute end of the past. I'll come back to that topic more specifically in the last chapter of this book. All right.
Is the body of
yeah.
the dead God dead or alive?
It's dead. It's dead. Well, you have to be careful here.
The
The
society.
eternal, I think in the Altizer chapter probably, where I do that kind of proportionality type analysis, I think there, using his text, I put together the upshot of what he's saying, that it's the eternal life in Altizer's reading of the historical Jesus, I think it's historical Jesus squared, the proof of that proportion. Historical Jesus squared, or read the actual historical Jesus for Altizer is the identity of eternal life and eternal death. Right? So, put it in more simplistic terms, which he uses, for example, in the Descent into Hell. Eternal life is heaven, and eternal death is hell. And what Altizer is saying is, so light in and as the form, in and as darkness. Heaven in and as hell. Is the only body in the death of God theology, is it alive or dead? Well, it's alive in and as dead.
Yeah.
That's the only way. But to the extent to which, so in other words, but then it's not, that's what I was saying in a totally abstract way a meeting or two back. We have to be very careful with the nothing here, because the nothing, in the thinking now occurring, there is no nothing, period. That makes it easy.
Yeah.
But in the death of God theology, the nothing, there's more to the nothing that meets the eye, right? There's something to that nothing, right? It's somehow or other a palpable nothingness.
Yeah.
Or in Altizer's language, he doesn't call it palpable nothingness, but in his more recent work, an actual nothingness. You might understand it's a nothingness that we experience. We experience the vacuity of our existence.
Darkness visible.
Right? We do. If we were honest, we experience this emptiness, you see? And Altizer has the great intellectual courage, perhaps moral courage, but certainly intellectual courage, to acknowledge it. I mean, not to go on pretending, you see, that things are as they used to be. So he is the prophet. So in this sense, I was once, I don't want to get too far off it, I was once in Cambridge with him. I don't know how the hell I got there. I was at some gathering. I think he was the topic, and so he showed up to defend himself, and it was a room full of these intellectual people from the Boston area, and some guy from BC, some Jesuit in disguise in civvies, was doing a kind of negative critique of Altizer's style, which is kind of, I could be this in person, but I don't think, my style is not bombastic, but there's something about Altizer's style, it's a little bombastic. And so I found myself defending him. Of course, what are you going to do? So my defense was, and which I was reminded of here because I was just about to say it without that context, that his vision, this courage that I'm saying of saying how it actually is prophetic. He's an Old Testament prophet, as it were. That's the mode in which he's in, and it's quite authentic to his mission, right? It's to say that, well, if I put it in Old Testament terms, what is it? I want justice, not sacrifice. Right? Altizer is saying something like that. Now it's more complicated, right? But in that sense, that strain, he's saying the emperor's clothes the emperor has no clothes on. That's what he's saying. But he's not running out to get him a new wardrobe. Well, great. The emperor has no clothes on. Now what do we do? Get the guy some clothes. See? Okay. The thinking now occurring is, coming
no
out of
emperor.
No, it's not. It's a set of clothes. It's the clothing. And I say, I love this I said this.
No, he said like McDermott is the getting him his clothes, and you're saying this clothes won't quite do it.
Well, no, McDermott wants to have a sewing party.
All of us doing the sewing.
Yeah, he wants us, right. I'm saying that it's a miracle, right? Here are the clothes, right? And this metaphor, which I just hit upon by accident here, is taken seriously in the section we're going to come to not too create the absolute edge, where I speak of the artifactual body in the context of there being no distinction. There's no possibility of the naked body now. There's no longer any possibility of the naked emperor. You see, if there were still a possibility, then all ties we'd be stuck there, right? But the body is
The
go back to
The skin is the clothes.
The body is the clothes.
the body is the clothing, right? And so that goes to the genetic engineering and all that stuff, right? Which is surprising to McDermott, you see, but in the context of the art is not surprising. It's surprising that we haven't got a thoroughgoing understanding of that on the table.
No, but I don't understand the body is the clothing.
Is the clothing?
Yeah, I don't understand it.
Clothing is fabrication.
Habit.
Well, okay, it's habit, but it's not a habit on something other
No,
than
it's the
itself.
It's the schema. It's
Yeah,
the same
the clothing
thing.
is it would
Clothing
be
is the
All
schema.
right.
an everyday
Okay.
metaphor. Yeah. Okay. Now, how did I get into that? Oh, the body here at the opening of this thing. Okay, so we did enough on that, and okay, so over on page 549, a little above the middle of the page, I think I'm speaking there. Well, let me go up to the top of the page and then come down about 10 lines or so after the dash. The existing individual as social product is reduced to nothing, so as to be in fact, however, as such, what it, as a matter of an explicitly categorically existent social individual of historical materialism, and what the non-categorically existent social individual of historical materialism, the absolutely social individual conceived monistically, that's Marx, could never be the materialized sense of a new humanity. I'm still speaking here of Altizer, the materialized sense of a new humanity, the organized sensation of a new world, the experience of the total presence of the God quality. This much of a new universe is no longer awaited. In Altizer, the experience of the totality of society as the silent nothing in the interior depths of individual consciousness, that is, every person's actual experience of the abyss, which is the unspoken total publicity of individual identity, is the existential actuality of the sense of a new world. Key word there, in addition to the italicized word, is sense, as not yet definable or conceivable. Right, the sense is there. The perception alternative to this actuality of total presence is that of a pragmatic instrumentalism unintentionally oblivious to the transcendent actuality of a new universe. And here I'm introducing McDermott as the alternative to that sense, where McDermott is in a more, I want to say, but it's really, I don't mean this literally, it's a relative thing. In some way, relative to Altizer, he's naively hoping and expecting, you see, for this kind of, this quilting party in which we can reconstruct something new, have a new religion, so to speak, or a new ritual to replace the rituals that have now become empty to us, right? That's his hope.
It's in the interrogative,
Yeah.
so I mean, it has a feeling of despair as much as hope.
Oh yeah, yeah,
It has the tone of John Lennon, imagine.
That's right. Can we learn how to gather together? I mean, can we?
Yeah, maybe.
It's an open question for him. That's right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So over on page 551, in the middle of the page, where it says, "Indeed, the experience of the death of God finally precludes the final closure of the situation. Very nothing finally precludes the conception of the object, finally precludes the final closure of the new world, one world construction. For its own part, very nothing precludes the experience of the body of God, the actual conception of the divine society. The actual material for a new world, it turns out, abysmal apocalypse, is pace Aristotle, sola prima materia." Now, what I'm doing there is bringing Aristotle into the negative, right? Literally, that says prime matter alone, sola, right? And it's a pun. I'm doing a little intellectual pun on sola fide, which is Luther, right? One is saved by faith alone. So it's as if, and I say pace Aristotle because Aristotle could never even imagine that one could have actual experience of prime matter, because prime matter is always informed, you see, in Aristotle, in our experience. Whereas what we're confronting, thanks to the work of modern self-consciousness, in its extremity, in the death of God theology of Altizer, is something that Aristotle could not conceive of, and that is, as it were, an immediate experience, and a totally uninformed...
It's the Negredo.
Meaning?
It's I've just suddenly flashed on this.
All right.
The alchemical stage, that's the beginning of the creative process, is the putrescence of everything that came before.
Okay.
And so it's called the Negredo, the blackening.
Okay.
And that's really what it is. It's you produce the next alchemical phase. Altizer is in the.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. All right. So he's reduced in print. Yeah. Well, that's probably a good analogy. He's reduced all of the form, all of the
what is the prima materia.
Right. To the prime matter, and that's what is experienced. That is
the dead body of God in the
and that is the presence of the Creator precisely in the form of its absence. Yeah. Okay. All right. So. I think it might be worth pausing.
You use the word anesthesia.
Yeah.
At the bottom of 515.
Right.
What are you trying to elicit?
Well, it's just
what go on.
It's another image for all of these other negativities. It's you have non-perception. The anesthesia would be aesthesia, the anti-perception, the non-perception.
What I say right before that, at the end of the previous sentence, the experience is ourselves not experienced. Right. It goes to this notion that our experience is the presence of the divine, total presence in the form of the absence of the divine. Right. So it's a sense of a new world in the form of a non-sense of it. Right. Almost literally so. In fact, I speak somewhere in today's assignment, which I don't know whether we'll get to, of the over on page 555, we're actually closing a circle here. This is the a priori sense organ passage toward the bottom of 555, and I go. Let me just repeat that part 5 or 6 lines up. Then that which precludes the final closure of the situation is the a priori existence of sense. The a priori sense organs, the essentially non-qualitative sense of existence, the transcendence of the nonsense of the cogito, the non-transcendence of the sense of the cogito, the non-I sense of identity, the sense of the non-I thought of transcendence. Now, all that's a complicated way of pointing out a radical disjunction in Altizer, which I say somewhere, between the I and the think. I don't know what I say on this page, but okay. In other words, they're taken apart. I think back in leading into the geometry of the dead center cube, I speak in Altizer's case of an absolute fragmentation of identity. If you think of identity in this sense now, all right, we have a new. Well, it's not a totally new sense. It's a little complicated. Certainly, traditionally, if you think of identity as the cogito, I think is, you could say in a very straightforward way, is the Cartesian identity. That's it. Yeah. That's it. I think. Okay. In Altizer, thanks to a lot of other things which we're not going to rehearse right this minute. Okay. What I say in the leading up to the dead center cube business is that Altizer's this give me the expression again for the blackness there.
The Negredo.
Okay, the Negredo. That is, in the language of this text, the absolute fragmentation of identity, the absolute fragmentation of I and think. By which I don't mean. By which, well, yeah. Well, yes, okay. Well, let me put it this way. By which I minimally mean the radical disconnect between the I and thinking. And so in terms of the question about the anesthetic function of or form of his thinking. If thinking in the Cartesian sense, and I have to be very careful here, or it's not really being careful, but it's something I have to point out, which I don't know whether because of our use of language, we don't always understand this. When Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, he might well have said, as they used to have a college T-shirt, and they probably still do, I haven't been in college recently. In college, you'll see a T-shirt every once in a while that says, I drink, therefore I am. Have you seen that one? You missed that? Okay. Well, it's a joke, but it's profound, because for Descartes, cogitations include knowledge, sensation, feeling, imagination. Do you see? So one of the cogitations that he might have, I cogito, could well be I drink. Okay. So in this sense, the fragmentation of the I and the think, which is one minimal level, the first level, so to speak, of the darkness introduced in, or achieved, better than introduced. It's introduced, but the real point is an achievement in Altizer, is to disconnect, you see, the ego from sensation, or to disconnect me from my own experience, or that my own experience is the experience of being empty, right? Of being dark, of being. My own experience is theologically he did it. We did it a long time ago. The I am in Altizer, the I am of God becomes I am not. So the truth in Altizer is that it's not just I am not. You see, he's not despite Altizer. He's not simply rehearsing or extending what Nietzsche did. For Nietzsche, it would be true to have God say I am not. And even that would be overdoing it in Nietzsche, but that's all Nietzsche would want to say. Or have God say for his own son, and bow out and leave the scene. But Altizer isn't saying, having God say, I am not. What God is saying in Altizer is, I am in and as I am not. You see? Okay. And so the existential, human, societal individual experiences this truth, this darkness, analogously as what? As I experience myself as not experiencing myself, right? My experience, I am present to myself as absent from myself.
It seems like this whole passage is a rehearsal of 50s, early 60s existential American neurosis, beatnik universe. This is it's like a philosophical run-through.
Altizer?
No, you.
Oh, me.
Your portrayal of Altizer's portrayal of American death of God theology consciousness is sort of its social connection is to the consciousness of American existentialism, namely Beat Generation, because it has all those stuff in it. It has this intense declaration of the death of God, the dramatization of a prophecy of a new enlightenment. You know, whether it's coming from Buddhism or booze or whatever, it's coming from somewhere. And it's all felt as the entire structure of Western consciousness collapsing into an interior emptiness that's experienced somatically.
Okay. All right. But then that is Altizer.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the anesthesia point suggests that the reality goes on.
I think it suggests practically, most mundane suggestion would be numbness.
But only a subjective numbness. In other words, the thing about anesthesia is that it masks the reality. The thing about the Beat Generation is that if you take enough LSD, it doesn't make any difference about
wrong generation.
Whatever. Don't be so thrilled with that, because the point is that whatever the reality is, it's masked somehow. As you say, we've been benumbed to it, but the reality is still there. The reality isn't changed.
Well,
is it?
Well,
the reality is there, but it's experienced in a different way.
Yeah.
That's your point. I think you're saying
well,
you're saying it's there,
I'm saying that,
whether it's experienced or not, or it's not experienced as it might be.
I'm saying that the profundity that you see in Altizer, seems to be exaggerated.
Okay, I'll meet you halfway and say this. Then I do speak in the text earlier on when I'm doing a close analysis of his work, of his thought being a strict insincerity. So I could put together what you're saying, that there's some truth in what you're saying, insofar as there is the cup is empty, but for an infinitesimal remaining quality. Right? In other words, it's not completely empty. So I would say, but however, I think the positive construal of that would be that's resolved in the notion that I would say that the absolute future, that in other words, his affirmative commitment is to possibility. And possibility is some kind of strange conjunction of existence and non-existence. And since he doesn't want to do any more, or need not do any more, he doesn't. I mean, and he doesn't have to solve that problem. All right. There are a couple of different things we could do, but I think one thing I should hit before we actually kind of follows on where we were. I think on page 5. Well, maybe it was backing up, but in any event, 559 going forward. This actually wraps back around what I was saying. I really covered the main theme already in talking about McDermott and the transplants and so forth. I just want to call your attention to the phraseology that I use to describe the understanding of the thinking now occurring on the bottom of 559, where I say, in fact, the horizon of the possible has been essentially left behind. Now that would apply in different ways, both to McDermott and to Altizer. Right? They're both occupying the horizon of the possible in different stances. One hopefully, and one in a kind of out-and-out despair, I think. Not only is the human organism transcending the human organism, but it is now essentially true for the first time that the human species is the species-making species. Right? And it seems to me that's a phrase which I articulated when I wrote this passage, and I don't feel any need to revise it. Right? And I think that's a fairly good summary of what, and it emphasizes. So in other words, if you were to say, all right, so traditionally we would say man is the zoon, ekon, logon, the living being who has reason, the animal rationale, the rational animal. Okay, but now rational animal, right, means something much more active, much more thoroughgoingly create. It's the I mean, even animal doesn't appear in it, right? I mean, it's an interesting question.
Remember there was that anthropology book in the late 60s, Gordon Child, that was being taught everywhere, called Man Makes Himself.
But this is saying more than that.
I know, but
no. In fact. Okay, but I'm glad you said that, because in fact, in the text, I distinguish that from McDermott's notion that the quilting party is a kind of self-making of mankind, or self-reconstruction, self-remaking. Yeah? And this prescinds, as you would expect it to, from the notion of self-making. So it's the human species is the species-making species, and not the species that's making itself. You say, or if I put it all together again quickly, it's the species-making species that is making itself, not in the sense of self-making, but it makes itself insofar as it makes the other, right? Insofar as the product of the act of the producer is a perfect otherness, which reminds me to say, by the way, that when I was looking at Peirce's notion of quality, his notion of quality is very close to what I put on the forum in response to the question that Todd asked me about self-identity. The question being, Todd's objection being that it's hard not to think of sameness and selfness when thinking about identity. And so I went into an etymology in which I wound up defining the root meaning of identity as just thatness, with no just thatness, right? Particularity, in effect, with no comparative reference either to the same as another or self-same, right? Just the focus on the just thatness, or the very thatness of something. Now, what made me think of that? Oh, so that was in the context of the notion that identity is the just thatness, and the identity of the act of the producer is absolute otherness. That is the very just thatness of what the constructive act is in the context of the thinking now occurring.
Can I ask on page 554,
All right.
in the middle, if James, for whom it was appropriate to inquire of an idea,
It's cash value.
Cash value. That's James's phrase, cash value.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I play with that, and we're pushing the clock, so I won't pursue it now, but it will come up at the beginning of the next session because we're getting very close to the end of this assignment tonight, thank God. And at the end of it, I do the little equation on investment. But since you raised the issue, just to meditate, Altizer is absolute liquidity in the chemical sense, but he's also absolute disinvestment. Right? It's all cash, and cash.
It's just representation.
Well, it's just representation, and it's useless.
It doesn't produce anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, even if you bought something with it, it'd be all right. You know what I mean?
But that doesn't produce anything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know it doesn't, but what I'm saying, even buying is better than just. Right. Okay. All right. Well, we'll go on. Thank you.
Thanks.